welcome and thank you very much for joining us here today. We are very pleased indeed with the numbers of people who I believe are going to be following this e-event. We only sent notice of it out about a week ago, and I believe we may be having up to about 160 or perhaps more joining us today from Europe, the US, the Caribbean, and various other places as well. I think what this proves is that fund domiciliation has just got an awful lot more interesting than it used to be. For my sins, I've been following the world of fund domiciliation for a very long time, and it's, as I say, suddenly taken on a life of its own in terms of interest. And I believe that was the case before COVID-19. And three things have happened pre-COVID-19 at pretty much the same time, the three Bs. The three Bs are BEPS, Brexit, and Brussels. And Brussels is shorthand for substance requirements that the jurisdictions are having to implement, some of them, and also blacklists that some, like Cayman, are having to endure, and all that other stuff that's coming out of the capital of the EU. But of course, the pandemic has thrown another spanner into the works. So we have an awful lot of stuff to talk about today. And by the way, you are all very welcome to join in. Please do use the question facility that you have on Zoom, but I would ask you please to keep your questions very short. They're much easier to get to and read out if you keep them very short. So, but please do use that facility, and please don't wait for me to say any questions. I probably won't do that. We will just carry on with our panel conversation here. Just use the Q&A when you feel so inclined to do. Before introducing the panel, I should just say to those of you who don't know IFI Global, and I believe there are some people out there that may not know us very well, we are a research and media house based in the City of London, although we haven't been in our office now for over 2 months, and goodness knows when we will be back in there. We did recently finish a major piece of research on the future of fund domiciliation. If anyone on this webinar would like a copy of that, please just email us and we will happily send that to you. Also, I wanted to let you know we are launching a regular online strategy forum in June for our subscribers to debate the future of domiciliation as well as fund governance and fund structuring. And we'll be doing that on a regular basis from June onwards, at least once a month, perhaps even more often. And the objective behind that is to come up with some policy recommendations, particularly for investors, so they can track what's going to be happening during this post-COVID-19 era I hope we'll be going into, or indeed living with this. Perhaps we'll be living with it for a very long time to come. Let me now introduce the panel. I deliberately tried to select a panel that would I hope everyone would agree is balanced, in that we have someone representing the EU, someone representing the Channel Islands, someone representing the Caribbean, as well as a London lawyer whose firm puts funds into all those places. Let me start by introducing Simon Firth. He is a partner at Arnold & Porter, which is a Washington, DC headquartered law firm. Simon is based in their London office. Elliot Revson is Director of Funds at Jersey Finance. His role is to define the strategy and direction of Jersey as a destination for funds and for alternative managers. Imelda Shine is Managing Director at Intertrust in Dublin. Intertrust is also very big in Luxembourg, and she's representing the whole EU here today, but also, of course, they're offshore too. And Imelda worked in asset management in the US as well as in Ireland. And Tony Travers, OBE, was a founder and senior partner at Maples and Calder in Cayman. And also he is a founder and senior partner at Travers Thorpe Alberga. He is also chairman of the Channel Islands Stock Exchange, and you might see him occasionally on Newsnight defending the offshore centres against charges that he would no doubt call malicious from the BBC that come his way from time to time. What I'm going to do is ask all of them to make brief introductory comments, and then we will get into our panel chat here. So Tony, I think you're up first. How do you see the future of fund domiciliation, given all the weird and wonderful things that are going on in the world at the moment?
Thank you, Simon. First, I'd like to correct the record. I'm actually one of the Cayman Islands Stock Exchange, not the Channel Islands Stock Exchange. I'd just like to make two preliminary and brief points, because I'd like to leave lots of time for what I believe will be your usual withering cross-examination. The first is in terms of context. Very often, as a result of these surveys, one gets the impression that offshore and onshore jurisdictions are fungible. So let's just take a look at relative size for a moment. The total funds market in Europe, if you look at UCITS alone, is around 9.7 trillion euros. The alternative space in Europe, hedge fund of funds, real estate and private equity, is around 4.7 trillion euros. Comparatively, Cayman, which does not compete in the UCITS space at all, the UCITS is obviously a European-centric product marketed well within the walls of Fortress Europe. But Cayman, if we look at the open-ended structures, has around $2.5 trillion. I'm not adjusting for March, which was apparently a very bad month. But in addition, we have the private equity. We don't know the precise number of the private equity assets under management. We will do, because we've just had extended this private funds law, which will require audited accounts to be filed here, also on the private equity space. But we estimate between 2 to 3 trillion. So you have around $5.5 trillion of assets under management in the Cayman space, which is the alternative space, which is slightly larger than the European figure, excluding UCITS. Jersey is relatively small. It has, if you exclude the private funds, which are around 140 billion, 345 billion in the private equity, in the alternative fund space. So those are the relative sizes of the important jurisdictions. And it really leads me to my second point, which is my version of the fund domiciliation principle. And that says simply, and I don't think it's inconsistent with your survey in any way, Simon, what it says is that when a jurisdiction obtains a certain critical mass, we have around 8,000 hedge funds in Cayman, around 21,000 private equity vehicles. And when that critical mass is supported by professional infrastructure, lawyers, accountants, then the status quo in relation to the selection of that jurisdiction tends to be maintained unless and until the cost or the regulatory burden of operating there become prohibitive and there is a more satisfactory alternative found. Now, in terms of the more satisfactory alternatives, what do we have? Well, actually, your survey touches on it very helpfully. We know there is a new vehicle in Hong Kong. We know that Singapore has offered tremendous incentives to fund managers wishing to locate or relocate. And the fund manager relocation is the major result of the economic substance application of those rules. Because funds themselves, we know, are out of scope. And we have your reference to the Canadian limited partnership vehicle now, which looks a lot like the vehicles they used in Scotland for a while before HMRC shut that down. So I actually will conclude by saying I agree with your survey. I don't agree with your conclusions from your survey because I don't think any major change is coming.
Well, thank you. And we will debate that hopefully in a few minutes' time. So thank you for putting that challenge down. Can I come to you, Elliot, for your introductory comments?
Thank you, Simon. I may have the inside track on this since we commissioned your report into the domiciliation. If I can just start by spending a few minutes putting our jurisdiction in perspective to frame the discussion. Jersey is an award-winning international finance centre whose reputation and regulation is acknowledged by independent assessments from some of the world's leading bodies, including the OECD, IMF, and the World Bank. This is supported by broad and deep expertise from the 14,000 people, or 44% of the working population, who work in our industry. Jersey is a crown dependency of the UK, but has its own government and negotiates its own bilateral agreements, private placement being a case in point. As such, our default is both political and fiscal stability, supported by a sound legal, regulatory, and economic environment. In the fourth quarter of 2019, we collaborated with Simon and commissioned a survey to look at the key trends in fund domiciliation. The report found that the key issues of Brexit, BEPS, substance, and transparency has shot up the agenda when it comes to domiciliation. These are the key themes that have dominated domiciliation to a greater or lesser extent in recent years and are likely to influence decision-making for some years to come. However, the number one takeaway from this report is that investors, and it is the investors who primarily determine domiciliation, want jurisdictions that can offer expertise and political and fiscal stability with a no-change outlook from a regulatory, legal, or economic perspective. Having been an early adopter of the issues mentioned of Brexit, BEPS, substance, and transparency, we have that respectability, we have that stability, and we have that no-change outlook. Further, we offer no surprises in relation to fees or regulation that usually accompanies changes to regulation. And this is supported by world-class infrastructure, for example, the third fastest broadband in the world.
Thank you very much. And Imelda, may I come to you for your intro comments?
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for inviting me to join your webinar today. I believe I'm the newbie of your crew here, so thanks for bringing me on board. It's interesting, you talked about your three Bs, BEPS, Brexit, and Brussels. So obviously we have some interesting points to cover. I'm based in Ireland. I work for Intertrust. We're a leading tech-enabled fund and corporate service provider. And as you mentioned at the outset, we have large presence in Cayman, in the Channel Islands, in Ireland, in Luxembourg. So I guess I don't particularly want to wear one hat. Obviously, I sit in Dublin, so obviously I have a preference for Ireland. But obviously, as a business, we're across multiple jurisdictions, and I suppose from our perspective, we can see trends happening in various different jurisdictions and what our clients are doing. I think one of the questions you posed for us at the outset was around what trends do we see from a domiciliation perspective? And, I think Tony brought it up at the beginning, and I don't disagree at all. I think it's very much, jurisdictions, and we see our clients pick jurisdictions based on, the well-trodden path, what works well. And, the trends can move a little bit around a particular asset class. And certainly from a European perspective, between Dublin and Luxembourg, a lot of the time it will vary between various different asset classes. I mean, Ireland is very well known around hedge and around ETFs. Luxembourg certainly steals the thunder when it comes to private equity. And certainly, but I mean, I think the output of your report and maybe I think you're going to maybe come through some of the main points on that, but certainly, the jurisdiction is well known by investors. It's a good base for distribution. Well covered from quality of people in the sector, be it the law firms, the accountancy firms, the service providers. So I suppose I don't really see those trends changing massively. For sure, there has been an increased focus around substance from a European perspective, and I think we'll see that continue. It might look a little bit different now because of COVID, but certainly that's a trend we would have seen right up to, and I don't really see that changing. So I suppose they were just some of my initial thoughts, and look forward to our wider discussion.
Excellent, thank you very much. And Simon, as I said by way of introduction, you're familiar doubtless with all the international fund jurisdictions, and as well as having the name Simon along with me, you don't have a particular jurisdiction in terms of one you prefer over another, I would guess.
I guess that's right. Thank you, Simon, for having me on the panel. Certainly, I may have a preference for the UK, and I may touch on that, but generally speaking, in terms of the jurisdictions we've discussed, I'm entirely even-handed. I thought that, you know, effectively being the neutral party on this panel, to understand the future of where domiciliation may go, I'd have a quick look back at the past, and I thought I'd look at starting, you know, roughly 20 years ago, and putting jurisdictions in boxes, which clearly runs the risk of me stereotyping them. But even with that said, I think, you know, 20 years ago, we had the relative beginnings of hedge funds, which had started off roughly in the 90s for European and UK hedge fund managers. And at that time, you know, you could have said the BVI and the Cayman were sort of neck and neck, particularly BVI perhaps for futures funds, CTA funds. But Cayman certainly stole a march. Also at that time, perhaps Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, you'd have been looking at for real estate funds, private equity funds, pure private funds, closed-end funds of that nature. Luxembourg then, I say, would very much for the UCITS. And Ireland was really just starting off and has gone at some considerable speed since then. So why I mentioned the UK is we mustn't forget that for private equity funds, the UK limited partnership has been a tried and tested structure since the late 80s, in fact, when the tax regime for that was sorted out. Don't forget Delaware either. We tend to talk about offshore, but clearly Delaware has many, many funds to rival the number that there are in Cayman. Then there were fund jurisdictions where you might use a treaty jurisdiction, such as Cyprus, so back in the day for setting up funds investing in Russia, recent Europe, Mauritius for South Africa, India, and so forth. So that was roughly the lay of the land. I appreciate there are some generalizations here. Then we had the financial crisis 10 years ago, which brought in the AIFMD. And at that stage, I'd say it was clear that Cayman was way out ahead for hedge funds. Ireland then had developed a lot and had developed the alternative UCITS. Luxembourg had done well in developing new structures for private equity, venture capital, particularly using treaty subsidiaries. And again, the Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, always strong, always very close to the UK, and we're going to talk about Brexit. And US investors clearly liked Cayman as well. So we basically had a big notch up in regulation at that time. So where are we now and where are we going to go? Without stealing the thunder of what we're all about to say, I mean, clearly for offshore jurisdictions, reputation, sophistication, substance, support, the kind of things we've already heard about are important. We'll likely have, I think, an entrenchment of the most flexible and most successful centres. I think you'll only see new offshore centres really stealing a march if there's a USP or a niche that they can get into. Maybe it's something to do with cryptocurrencies, or maybe it's to do with a particular regional angle. Tony mentioned Hong Kong, for example. And you also mentioned Canada. Now, in the US, we're seeing Canadian funds being set up, sometimes in preference now to Cayman, because Cayman is seen in some quarters as now becoming over-regulated. And your survey refers to super compliance. So in a sense, the offshore centres are supposed to behave at a standard that's even higher than others in terms of anti-money laundering and private fund regulation and so on. So, you know, I'm clear that substance is here to stay, that regulation is here to stay. I think the success of places like Cayman and Jersey and Guernsey and the island for Luxembourg, for the reasons we've mentioned, will stay, but there will be challenges to come from For example, for Luxembourg with BEPS, which hasn't yet been properly addressed. Brexit is still a known unknown in terms of where that will lead. UK managers, how the UK will be treated in the EU. Will we get equivalents? Will we actually have a UK onshore fund code that we develop over time? And although that is something that has been discussed and is because of last year's political upheaval and now COVID has been parked, but I'm sure that will come back and people will be interested to see how the UK can develop itself as a fund centre. So that's my non-neutral part, but that's my summary of where we were and where we are and where we might be.
Thank you very much. Well, now we're going to get into hopefully a lot of cut and thrust debate, a bit of luck, maybe a bit of disagreement as well. That would be fantastic. And we're going to start with the emergency measures and then go on to the recent blacklisting of Cayman. Then some of the themes that have already been referred to a number of times have come out of the research survey we did recently. So let's start with the emergency measures. And in a way, almost to challenge something you just said, Simon, but please all chip in here. You said substance is here to stay, but clearly we're in this extraordinary situation at the moment where no one can travel. I just heard before we went on Elliot Revson saying there are no flights at the moment, even between the Channel Islands and Gatwick, although there is one to Southampton. We don't know as we sit here this afternoon when air travel is ever going to get back to the sort of level it was at until perhaps the end of February, the ease at which we were all able to jump on a plane without even thinking about it, go and sign documents in the jurisdiction where the fund was domiciled, have board meetings there, do all the stuff we're so used to doing. That is clearly, that's temporarily halted. My question is, might the temporary become permanent? Might we be in a situation somewhat like this for potentially a long time to come? And what does that mean for the way that the whole entire international stroke alternative fund industry is structured in these international fund domiciles if physical activity between individuals in different places basically is halted or very severely curtailed? Who would like to take that first? Tony, do you want to have a go at that? What happens if no one can get to Cayman? What happens if no one from Cayman can get to New York or London?
And no one from Cayman can get off of Cayman.
So what does this mean for the way the industry has been structured over the last 20, if I may call you a veteran of the business going back to the early 1990s?
Actually, veteran is extremely charitable. I go back a lot further than that. Look, one or 2 points. Firstly, in terms of structuring these vehicles in Cayman, very little changes because nobody ever thought it was essential to travel to the Cayman Islands to set up a hedge fund. We can do that within a week in any event and can still do so, albeit the troops are all working remotely. So I don't see any fundamental change there. Directors' meetings, management control, and the UK tax test of that, actually, I accept may be somewhat more problematic. But that is a tax test that's always existed, not a substance test. Frankly, I see the substance rules as not affecting Cayman. I can see there are very good reasons for introducing the substance rules where you are dealing with Eurocentric jurisdictions which have double tax treaties. Access to a double tax treaty, and there have been significant, in fact, huge abuses, which is really what has generated the whole BEPS movement. But where you have double tax treaties with shell companies, clearly that is problematic. And clearly in Europe, we can see good reason for, say, the Dutch legislation, which says to access a double tax treaty, you really have to have something happening in the jurisdiction. And I think that legislation will move across Europe. But in terms of a jurisdiction like Cayman, the substance rules are delusional. Nobody has ever said in the common law world, and I'm no expert on the Code Napoleon, But in the common law world, no one has ever said, right up to the Supreme Court, that to have a transaction in intangibles, whether it's securities, derivatives, or whatever may be, that you have to have a building with a roof over it and people in it. And in fact, when you look at the way the world is going, when you look at cryptocurrency, and you look at the fact that you can trade $1 billion by pressing a button on an iPhone, the whole substance movement in relation to the validity of a transaction, or challenging the validity of a transaction, is to me a complete nonsense, and should ultimately fail.
It may be a complete nonsense, and it should probably ultimately fail, but unfortunately that's what the EU has deemed as necessary. If you take Jersey, I'd like to come to Elliot and Imelda on this. What they have been doing since the beginning of this year, and perhaps longer, is putting in very serious and quite strict substance requirements in these jurisdictions in order to comply with rules and regulations. The reason I'm going to ask Imelda after Elliot to come in, because you could argue in some respect with Brexit, they're doing something similar. They're only allowing British managers into Dublin or Luxembourg who display that same sort of physical presence that Tony, in a way, was referring to that's taking place offshore. But before we get to the EU jurisdictions, Elliot, am I right in saying you've had, I wouldn't say you've had to jump through hoops. I know you'll say this is good standards you've employed for a long time anyway. But nonetheless, you've had to meet a measure imposed upon you by Brussels. Am I right in saying?
From a Jersey perspective, the substance requirements and the changes to the law that were made here was very little other than the codification of what was best practice. So there has not been a significant change. The people have had substance within Jersey for many years. Over recent years, we've seen private equity managers, hedge managers strengthening their presence. But as I said, it was a codification of best practice. It was happening anyway.
Before I bring Imelda in, in order to foment disagreement and debate here, you call it a codification of best practice, but if I've understood Tony correctly, he was saying this is not really necessary in an offshore jurisdiction. You're implying, and you're probably right if you are implying it, that Guernsey and Jersey are going off in one direction, the Caribbean is perhaps going off in another direction. The gap across the Atlantic has got wider, perhaps because of the EU substance requirements, or perhaps because of the way the nature is built in the last few, business is built in the last few years. Is that a fair comment?
Well, if you bring BEPS into the equation, then that changes it considerably.
Okay.
Let me say, Simon, that in fact the same substance regulations that were introduced in Jersey have been introduced in Cayman, and that was the EU mandate. I'm simply saying for no good reason. But the effect of it in Cayman is simply in relation to fund managers mainly. There are 9 categories of scope, but fund management is really what we're talking about for today's purposes. And actually, I agree with Elliot. If you took a look at the UK tax position on fund management and being able to retain profit in the offshore fund manager, actually, you don't see any major change here, because HMRC would have said you had to have substance and you had to have real things happening in your offshore manager if you were going to retain profit in it tax-free. So in that sense, yes, I agree, there was no fundamental change. The crucial point is the express train coming down the tunnel. Are the EU going to stop at fund management, or are they going to seek to put funds in scope?
Yeah.
And that discussion has yet to be had.
Can I come back to you, Imelda, because you, in a sense, both in Dublin and in Luxembourg, have had your own substance requirements imposed upon you, or not so much imposed upon you, but imposed upon the British managers who want to come and set up in Ireland and or Luxembourg. And the CBI has been very strict and very clear in what it's saying in terms of having substance. Do you think any of that, how's that going in general? Because there's only so many people on the island of Ireland that can have the capacity to do the jobs. And B, do you think that's affected by COVID-19 and the pandemic, particularly if air travel is going to be severely curtailed?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I guess obviously, to see how much the emergency measures, how they become enshrined post-COVID, it's hard to tell at this point. And certainly there's no indication, the central bank and indeed the CSSF have engaged with fund managers on a regular basis. And that's really more about investor protection and understanding liquidity or any concerns within funds. So that has sort of been their main focus, and they have allowed some forbearance in terms of some deadlines. So they're basically the main, and obviously meetings can take place, whether it's investment committee meetings or board meetings. They've all been allowed to take place remotely, like ourselves right now. So they're basically the main emergency measures that have been put in place. But I think this substance requirement has certainly been something that's been a huge feature of the European landscape, and certainly since 2004 or 14-15 with the introduction of AIFMD. So I would agree with Elliot in that part that this substance requirement has been in place here for a number of years. I think it came under more scrutiny or under more spotlight post-Brexit, or in this, as Brexit conversation have happened, as managers have looked to set up either in Dublin or in Luxembourg or indeed in Paris or Frankfurt or wherever else the chosen destination was. But I think from an asset management perspective, you certainly saw a big move between Dublin and Luxembourg. So there has been a huge focus from the CBI on substance in terms of the mancos. Absolutely, Tony, you're right. It hasn't really focused down at the fund level just yet, but certainly at the manco level, we've seen a huge focus on substance. But I think from a jurisdiction perspective on both sides, for sure, there's been huge demand around risk professionals, around compliance professionals. But I think the industry has worked well with the central bank, and I think the central bank and the CSSF have worked with companies around that, and there has been open dialogue. But it has certainly put pressure on managers in terms of the substance that they've felt they've had to put on the ground here, and maybe struggled with, we have this substance in London or wherever it is, and now we have to double down in Dublin or Luxembourg. But I think from the industry's perspective, it's done quite well, and the CBI have come into managers over the last several months. Obviously, I think their inspections were halted on the back of COVID, but certainly I think they've said that they had met something like 80% of the managers they'd hoped to speak with. So we will see some sort of a dear CEO letter in the coming months. But I think in terms of, it's hard to tell at this point what the emergency measures, how that might have a long-term impact on substance. But certainly the direction of travel prior to COVID was very much increased substance, particularly around investment management, risk, compliance, and I think that's true across the EU.
Thank you. We've had two questions coming in, and I'm going to throw both questions. They're two very different questions, both excellent questions, at the panel before we get onto the subject of the EU's blacklisting of Cayman and how and the fallout potentially of that. So I'm going to read out both these questions. One question is, which is an excellent one, which is, how do you define substance? And the person who's written this has gone on to say, is substance really just a license fee to enable the offshore domiciles to gain access to onshore markets? And then the other question is, where is the best place to domicile an illiquid alternative fund for global distribution? Who wants to go to that first? Simon, is the independent arbiter on this. Can you give an unbiased view from 9,000 feet in the air in those two particular questions in a pithy, short way?
Well, I mean, isn't substance a bit like compliance? Sort of every 2 years it replicates itself twice. Substance is jobs, substance is compliance. And I hear what Tony says, but I don't think substance is going away in any shape or form. It is presence now. At the moment, it's socially distant presence, but There are, I was going to say, just as a footnote to the previous conversation, clearly jurisdictions which are untainted by substance requirements, and we mentioned Canada as one of those, and perhaps one or two Far Eastern jurisdictions like Hong Kong and Singapore to a point. And obviously Delaware, there's not a great deal one needs to do in Delaware to maintain substance, other than to have your fund registered in a building which has more funds registered than the one that Barack Obama once mentioned. On the second point about illiquid funds, I mean, all the main centres now are looking to be, I don't want to say that old cliche, user-friendly for any variety of funds. And if you go back to my old stereotypic formula, then, you know, if you have an illiquid closed-end fund, you're not looking to market it in the EU, you don't need a passport. Why not set it up in Jersey, Guernsey? You know, that would be a one-time the default, and that might be a good choice.
That building that Barack Obama referred to, I think, was Ugland House, and you were probably in there at the time, Tony.
I was indeed, and he was wrong on both points. It was not a tax scam, and nor was it the largest building in the world. But I mean, to go back to one point from the question, the real heresy in these substance rules is that there is no quid pro quo. You can introduce them, but the EU did not say, and in exchange for doing so, we will extend the passport under AIFMD to you as a result, whoever you may be, Cayman, Jersey, whatever. And in fact, we now believe the passport mechanism is dead in the water. There will be no passport under the AIFMD. And so to us in Cayman, notwithstanding the application of the rules, Europe is effectively a dead zone. Only 6% of investment in Cayman funds comes from Europe, and I think that will go to zero because that 6% must have been made under the national private placement regimes, and I expect those are going to fade out. So the whole heresy of the application of the substance rules to Cayman is that in Cayman we care less about Europe.
Okay. Elliot, that was an interesting point you made about the AIFMD passport. Is that what you see from Jersey, that there's not be any passport extension under AIFMD? Because you and Guernsey were first in line to get the passport extension, I believe I'm right in saying.
Well, certainly we are still first in line to get the passport, but let me give you a statistic. Only 3% of alternative investment fund managers market in more than 3 European locations. So on that basis, it means that 97% of managers do not market on a pan-European basis. For those managers, private placement and Jersey's opt-in, opt-out AIFMD regime is a very efficient, very cost-effective way to market. And to put some colour, go on.
Can I ask, if that's the case, and I'm sure it is the case, why do so many managers put their funds in Dublin and Luxembourg when they're really just marketing funds into the EU, into just a handful of jurisdictions in the EU? Why not save a lot of money and go to Guernsey or Jersey?
Well, because the passport hasn't actually been extended.
No, but Elliot's saying you don't need that.
But Tony, you don't need the passport with private placement.
Elliot's saying...
I know, but the passport and private placement are two different things. All I am saying is that the passport hasn't been extended, and therefore Dublin and Luxembourg are superior jurisdictions for pan-European marketing.
But Elliot's saying there's only, you know, if you're a typical...
That's the EU's own statistic. Only 3% of managers market in more than 3 EU countries. And that's probably the basis why in the KPMG AIFMD2 survey, there was a very strong demand from managers that private placement is not taken away. And it's my understanding that private placement will not go away until 3 years after the passport is granted.
And there's also the elephant in the room there, Simon. There is, of course, reverse solicitation, which
yes.
as we all know, is actively active solicitation, sometimes in a covert guise. Hasn't gone away, hasn't needed to go away because NPPR has not been closed off. The passport hasn't been extended to third country managers. And although there are new marketing rules coming in next year, which make it harder to solicit reversedly, that US managers are quite happy to come into Europe on that basis.
I'm going to endorse what you. Sorry, I'm going to endorse what you said and move on to another point, because I know there are some US managers and certainly some US lawyers following this. And just to endorse what Simon's just said, reverse solicitation is very popular with Americans coming into Europe. And there's the point that's often made when we have these discussions in New York. I don't think anyone's ever been, they say, oh, it's very dangerous and you can be in big trouble. But I think I'm right in saying no one's ever been had up under the reverse solicitation rules. If you have a good law firm doing what it should be doing, you should be able to avoid any legal problems with it. But I won't go, if you don't mind. We've sadly only got 20 minutes to go. So there's an awful lot more I want to get into. And I do really want to get into this topic because I don't think it was just came up just before the COVID-19 crisis hit. To my astonishment, I don't know about everybody else's, I was very surprised indeed when the EU went ahead and announced it was blacklisting Cayman back in, I think it was February this year. If you read, there was an awful lot of literature put out by all the law firms. Cayman's very good when something like this happens. They all go into overdrive in putting their spin on what's happened. And the spin was that, Cayman was just a little bit late in getting its regulations in order, and no problem at all. Come October, that's when the next ECOFIN meeting's happening. We're going to be taken off that blacklist. Nothing to see here, not a problem at all. I actually don't necessarily agree with that. I think it is a problem. I don't think it's guaranteed. Cayman is coming off in October, even if it turns out we're having a more normal autumn than we are this spring. I think it's a very dangerous measure and that what's come in. And I'd like to ally that with a question both to, first Tony, then Imelda, which was really very odd. Luxembourg just went and brought in quote unquote defensive measures against Cayman. This is only in the last month or 5 or 6 weeks since the crisis, the pandemic has hit. Why they had time to do that, I do not know, but they did. Ireland has not. They've decided not to do that. Can someone please explain to me what's really going on? Perhaps first Tony, then Imelda.
Well, yes. The conclusion from the various bits of know-how you've been reading is probably right. I think there is a bigger problem here, though, that I'd like to touch on first. And that is that clearly what this shows is that the advice given to the Cayman Island government by certain accounting firms and bankers to appease the EU in introducing economic substance legislation in the first place was clearly wrong, because the advice that was given all said, if you are blacklisted, there will be a serious problem because you will lose your New York correspondent banking relations. And that's what drove the Cayman government to this unnecessary course of appeasement. In fact, paradoxically, what we now know is, having been blacklisted, no New York correspondent banking relationships have actually been terminated, and life goes on. When you look at the defensive measures, they are all effectively impotent in terms of doing anything particular to Cayman, because we have a very, very small investor base in the EU. You're talking about defensive measures, including the introduction of withholding tax. It exists anyway, say, from certain Eastern European countries. You're talking about not being eligible for European fund financing. Well, Cayman isn't anyway. You are talking about enhanced control foreign corporation regulations. All the EU countries have it anyway. So you're wrong. It's a bad thing in terms of the effect of the blacklist, but you're right in terms of it not being a good thing in terms of reputation. But what you can't tell me, and what no one can tell me, is what exactly it was that Cayman was non-compliant with. Because the the fake narrative on all of this, that in some way Moscovici is right, and that Cayman is not compliant with some sort of international tax regime. Well, we're compliant with FATCA. We're compliant with the Common Reporting Standard. The Cayman structures all pay tax in the jurisdiction of investment. So the whole issue of non-compliance, which is the so-called argument in favor of this extraterritorial legislation by the EU is nonsense. Now, the specific point about the blacklist had nothing whatsoever to do with tax. It actually was a failure to regulate or introduce regulation in good time, according to the Code of Conduct group of the EU, of legislation to regulate private funds in Cayman. Now, there's no doubt the Code of Conduct group breached their own internal rules on this, because blacklisting is supposed to be used only in circumstances where legislation, particular legislation, is being encouraged. And the Code of Conduct group knew very well that this legislation was in course of legislation. It was 3 days late. But nevertheless, the Code of Conduct group, not the EU Tax Commission, decided to put us on this blacklist. The effects of this, have been marginal to none, save reputationally, because people assume the blacklist, as you put it in your invitation, the naughty step, I think you called it, it assumes some sort of non-compliance, which frankly is delusional. However, the thing sits there. The EU will do whatever they can. And I mentioned their statistics earlier. The Cayman hedge and private equity market is about 35% of the entire funds market in Europe. Cayman is regarded as a threat to the EU, and there is no doubt the EU will do whatever it can to maintain the reputational damage to Cayman, but not for any good reason, and no one can tell me that there is a good reason.
Okay, thank you. Imelda, this is a tough one for you because you're based there, as you are, in Dublin. I'm going to ask you, as a good, loyal Irish patriot, to defend Luxembourg here in what they did. Why on earth now? I mean, surely in this mad and crazy world that we are living in, the politicians of Luxembourg had better things to do with their time than to introduce quote unquote defensive measures against Cayman. Whereas in Ireland, where you administrate an awful lot of Cayman domicile funds in Dublin, it's business as usual as far as I'm aware. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, I guess, and I think, first of all, going back to Tony's point, I suppose, a lot of the rhetoric that I read and see here is that it was a timing scenario, and this all will be corrected, and the compliance will be in place by October. And I think even Cayman have come out very recently and confirmed that now everything is up to date and in place. So I'm far from a Cayman expert, and we clearly have one on the panel, but I mean, I think to a large degree that's how the industry is progressing here, that it will be taken forward come October time. Obviously we've got a slight interruption here, but I think it's probably, there's not a whole pile to read into either. Yes, Luxembourg have brought out draft defensive legislation, for some Cayman vehicles, and Ireland haven't. But having said that, Ireland are absolutely going to, comply with EU regulation and toe the line in terms of the EU. So I don't know that there's a massive. Probably doesn't make for a great argument, but you know what I mean? I think maybe the headlines are maybe a little bit more than the reality of it is. Yes, Luxembourg have put draft legislation in place, and to some degree they probably have to defend themselves, because sometimes they can come under fire as well. No different to Ireland can come under fire as well. So, I don't see massive changes there. Certainly, I think Ireland and Luxembourg will comply with whatever sanctions the EU determine will have to be put in place, whether they're sanctions, defensive measures. I don't, I mean, I guess Tony or Simon or Elliot could disagree with me there, but I think, for sure both jurisdictions will comply with what gets determined at an EU level. But I think our working assumption is that the EU, or that, you know, the Cayman, because they've now made the changes, you know, and I suppose, you know, met the deadlines, you will see that change come October time.
Okay. And Elliot, from your perspective in Jersey, looking at what's happened this year to Cayman, do you have any concerns at all that the Crown dependencies could be put into a similar situation at some point in the future? Particularly, let's say, I'm going to draw out a hypothetical, which hopefully won't happen. Let's say we have a very bad Brexit breakup. The powers that be in Brussels want to teach us from the UK and its Crown dependencies and overseas territories a lesson. Is there a danger that what's happened with Cayman, as Tony referred to it, I called being put on the naughty step, could the same thing could apply to you?
I certainly don't want to get into the Cayman issue, but from a Jersey perspective, we have Jersey's Crown dependency and has bilateral relationships with all European countries in our own right. In respect of the substance requirements, you know, we were held up as a bastion of the implementation of the requirements. So, you know, we are a good neighbour.
Okay. Simon, do you want to add anything to this? Otherwise, I'm going to get on to there's the final topic, which is some of the in the few minutes we have remaining, some of the survey results we haven't touched upon so far.
So just to follow on from what Elliot was saying, I mean, the very fact that Jersey, Guernsey were on the shortlist for AIFM third country approval, it would be odd, therefore, if there was any backtracking on that, I think. Clearly, they may decide to treat them the same way as the UK and just park these issues for some time. Depends where we get to with Brexit, but at the moment it looks like there won't be a transition period. The transition period won't be extended. Following on the Cayman issue, I mean, I haven't seen any change in people's views. We've had the odd person, client coming saying, we're not going to use Cayman, can we use Bermuda, which was an interesting alternative. I think the issue is what happens. You know, if the EU is determined to nail Cayman and keep it on the naughty step permanently, it can always find a reason for doing that. I gather that people don't really expect that, and if it steps down from there and rejoins the whitelisted countries, then there will have been no change, just a minor blip.
Okay, thank you. Sadly, we haven't got very long. I'm going to try and bring up two subjects in the 7 or so minutes we have left remaining. And one of them did come out reasonably clearly. Thank goodness we included investors in the survey that we did that Elliot's referred to, the Jersey Finance Commission. And we didn't find this until we interviewed the investors, which is we discovered some degree, I'm not going to put it too strongly, but some degree of investor dissatisfaction at the recent increase in costs in all international fund jurisdictions. But funny enough, Imelda, especially those in the EU. I don't know whether there is any statistics on this, but certainly some of the things that we were picking up on, costs have gone up, I understand, very substantially indeed in Dublin and in Luxembourg, but they've also gone up everywhere. They've gone up in Guernsey and Jersey, and doubtless they've probably gone up in. So how much of that extra cost, whatever it is, it's probably a quite significant degree. I understand to be chief risk officer of the major Manco platform, you can command a salary that's part of 200,000 euros a year in Dublin or Luxembourg. And there are many other people doing some of the jobs like that in these jurisdictions. How much of that really helps investors? Because the ones we interviewed anyway didn't think it was necessarily worth all the extra cost. Don't know whether you heard that, Imelda?
I did, yeah. Sorry, I had to sort out my battery, apologies. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, at the end of the day, what the Central Bank of Ireland and the CSSF and European regulators, it's, you know, it's about maintaining and protecting investors. So I guess that continues to be the situation. You know, obviously, and I guess you can argue that, you know, in Cayman as well, and Jersey, I mean, they're all high cost jurisdictions in terms of you know people in the industry. So we haven't seen it. I mean, for sure, investors who are typically used to non-regulated product, when they move into a regulated product, all the layers of cost, I think they definitely get sticker shock from that perspective. But I guess investors who have been in regulated product all along, I think they're more used to the regulation and the cost. But certainly, I think it is a factor that has been an issue, and certainly I think from a cost perspective in these jurisdictions, it has been down to, you know, increased demand. A lot of it has been driven in the last year and a half or so on the back of Brexit and a sort of a race for managers to set up an alternative jurisdiction. So I guess we'll have to see, you know, the longer term play on how that is, and if these costs continue to be, you know, are pushed down to investors, or do they get absorbed at the managers. So I think that's probably something we will start to see over the course of the next while.
Okay, thank you. Unless anyone else wants to answer on cost and substance in the seconds we have left, one other subject I want to raise, which is in relation to Brexit, something we did talk about on the prep call, we haven't raised at all, is the possibility, although Simon did touch upon it, of the UK becoming an international fund domicile post-Brexit. A, do you think, Simon, that might happen? Just very short, if you don't mind. And B, everybody, what would be the impact upon the established international fund domiciles, especially Dublin or Luxembourg, and indeed Guernsey, Jersey, and Cayman as well? If you could all give very short answers to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah,
Can
well, conceptually it might happen, because at the time that this was being discussed, it was being discussed between the Treasury, the Revenue, and the FCA. And there was also a political will to take it forward. As I say, it's somewhat moved to one side because of COVID and Brexit. But if the tax can be sorted out for UK funds, and if it's not deemed too politically sensitive, then in the medium term, we should watch that space.
Very quickly, everybody else, what effect, if that was to happen in the medium term, as Simon says, what effect would it have on your jurisdictions? Anybody?
Well, it would clearly have some effect, but you know, one would have to look at the detail to ascertain precisely.
Elliot, I guess Jersey would be would be very bad. Could be very significantly. It could affect you quite a lot.
I'd second Tony's comment. You'd have to look at the details on how it looks, and I'd also echo Simon's comments that they would need to get their tax house in order before they were able to move forward.
All right. You got any thoughts on that? Of course, the huge numbers of UK fund managers and funds in Ireland. So, but you probably don't, Imelda, at this stage. You probably wouldn't have. But please say if you do. Any particular comments on that? Could you see Liverpool as a rival to Dublin? Get the old boat across from Dublin to Liverpool.
maybe. Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll have to see the detail on that for sure. But yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, so much has been delayed on the whole Brexit scenario, and maybe it'll start to move forward at a bit more speed now, once we all start to emerge a little bit more post-COVID. So I guess, yeah, let's wait and see.
Right. Final question of the afternoon to the lot of you. If you can give me a very short, very, very quick answer. If we were doing this again in a year's time, what would be different in the world of fund domiciliation from today? Obviously, if I asked you that question a few months ago, no one would have predicted COVID-19. So subject to some crazy thing like that coming along that we can't obviously anticipate, what might be different in a year's time? One word.
Well, I've been around a very, very long time, and I think the answer to your question is probably nothing.
All right. That's
yeah, a
a
continuation
short
of
short answer anyway.
a continuation of the trend to greater substance and BEPS and Brexit that we started out by saying were the prevailing trends. In short, very little difference.
Thank you.
I think a lot more technology. I mean, I agree with the same direction of travel around substance, but I think technology will continue to play, you know, a huge factor here, and how managers can embrace technology. Obviously, managers have done a huge job of embracing it in the last couple of weeks, but I definitely think that will, you know, enhancements around fintech, we'll see a lot more in that space.
Yeah,
Simon,
and if there's a
gonna...
second wave of COVID, then, you know, maybe an entrenchment of all the things we've been going through the last 3 months. So more, you know, just substance being under the home roof rather than the office roof somewhere.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for following this webcast today. Thank you, Elliot, Simon, Tony, and Imelda for your contributions. Just to let you know what's coming up, this time next week, we're doing something on fund governance in the EU jurisdictions, on the structures in there. And then the first of these strategy forums happens in early June, which we're going to be discussing the extraordinary case of what's called vicarious liability brought against DMS in the Tangerine case, and what that might mean for fund governance in Cayman and perhaps more broadly, and also the S&G in ESG, and how that may have been affected or will be affected by the coronavirus. But that's enough for today. Thank you all again for your following this, for your questions, and to the panel, and see you hopefully again very soon. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Simon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sam.